it should be very, very beautiful to have you here and to be together today. But so is the life, and we have to work in the distance. It's a pity. Yeah. Well, continuamos con nuestro ciclo de conferencias de este año. Ya sabéis que tenemos habitualmente pues el ciclo de conferencias en el que insertamos la participación de ilustres colegas extranjeros. Ahora mismo vamos a contar de nuevo con la presencia de Sandra Buechler, que ha estado con nosotros ya varias veces. Es una gran profesional, gran amiga de nosotros, gran colaboradora, y siempre hemos disfrutado mucho cuando haya estado aquí, y hoy también supongo que disfrutaremos bastante, aunque no podemos estar directamente con su presencia. Es de las personas, de los profesionales que tienen más cosas publicadas con nosotros. Seguramente la palma se la lleva Joan Coder, pero Sandra tiene 3 importantes libros publicados desde el 15, en el 18 y en el 19, que son el de Marcando la diferencia en las vidas de los pacientes. Espero que se vea, se ve. Bien. La cámara aquí. Ya estoy yo con... ¿Cuál es la cámara que está funcionando? El segundo que os quería comentar es Valores en la clínica, emociones que guían el tratamiento psicoanalítico. Y finalmente, el último, Comprendiendo y tratando a pacientes en psicoanálisis clínico, lecciones desde la literatura, que es de los más recientes. Son respectivamente dentro de nuestra colección el número 14, el 20 y el 22. Sandra va a dar una conferencia, y mañana la tendremos también en el curso de mañana y tarde. La conferencia se titula Fuentes de inspiración para los clínicos. Luego tendremos un comentario. Ya sabéis que el formato aproximado de las conferencias es la conferencia del autor invitado, luego un comentario. En este caso el comentario va a dar nuestro compañero miembro del instituto, gran amigo Mario Nervi, gran colaborador también nuestro. Voy a hacer esta presentación rápida de Sandra. Está ubicada en Nueva York, es supervisora en la William Alanson White Institute. Me sigue saliendo lo de es el instituto William Alanson White, donde también se formó, en el programa postdoctoral del Columbia Presbyterian Hospital y en el Institute for Contemporary Psychotherapy. Actualmente está retirada de la práctica clínica, pero como la vemos tiene una actividad endiablada, es decir, sigue teniendo muchas cosas y mucha actividad. Entre sus obras, bueno, pues las que hemos citado, no voy a repetir. Hay alguna que probablemente en el futuro podamos incorporar también a la colección. La frase que sí se repite en el comienzo y que a mí con la que me he quedado, que también la incluimos en esta portadilla, es la idea de Nietzsche. El filósofo Nietzsche dijo una vez: si tenemos un porqué, podemos vivir con cualquier cómo. Esa es la idea inicial que Sandra nos va a explicar y que luego retomará también Mario. Sandra, no sé si quieres empezar ya con tu presentación. Primero voy a pedir al público presente y en directo y presente a través de las cámaras un aplauso para Sandra.
Thank you. Okay. The philosopher Nietzsche once said, if we have a why, we can live with any how. That is, if we have a strong sense of purpose, a strong feeling that what we are doing is important and has meaning, we can deal with difficulties. So for the clinician, if we have a firm sense of why we are doing treatment, of its significance, of its potential to enrich the lives of our patients and ourselves, we can bear the difficulties of doing treatment. In this talk, I describe the why, that is, some of the reasons doing treatment is a worthwhile profession. To anticipate, I will suggest 3 sources of the inspiration to do treatment. 1, clinicians can help raise patients' conscious awareness of the stories of their lives. Creating a coherent narrative of their lives can be a motivating treatment goal. 2, we can help people break out of psychological prisons and lead freer lives. 3, we can inspire patients and be inspired ourselves to connect with the life force, the will to live within us, within all of us. First section, helping people tell their stories and recognize patterns. In my training at the William Alanson White Institute from 1979 to 1983, I was taught to get a detailed history of the patient's life experience. I would never suggest that everyone should always start treatment that way, but I can say it has its benefits. It can help both patient and clinician recognize the interpersonal situations, dilemmas, conflicts that have recurred in the patient's life. In other words, what keeps happening? What does the patient repeatedly do in relationships with other people? What recurs in their jobs, in their partnerships, in their inner life, in their child rearing? For some patients, recognizing these patterns is very significant. It can help them have a story of their lives, a narrative that makes more sense of what has happened. For some, it helps them forgive themselves for whatever they now see as mistakes. They begin to understand what led up to these errors, if indeed they still seem like errors. But it may also help them take responsibility for their own part in whatever keeps happening. There can be something very satisfying about having a narrative of your life, of feeling you make sense to yourself. So one vital purpose of treatment can be helping the patient develop this narrative. In my work, I found that this period of talking about the patient's past helped us develop a language with each other. Every intimate relationship, including treatment, has a special language, words that have mutually understood shared meanings. Closeness with another person helps us develop that language, and developing our language helps us feel close. So, for example, if we discover when we examine his history that the patient's aunt always defended the patient as a child, for the rest of the treatment, we can say something like, "Oh, that's like what your aunt did when you were a child." And we both know what that means without any more explanation. People who begin recognizing the patterns in their lives often feel a sense of wholeness. Here is a wonderful poem about that. The poem is called "The Way It Is," and it's by William Stafford. There is a thread you follow. It goes among things that change, but it does not change. People wonder about what you are pursuing. You have to explain about the thread, but it is hard for others to see. While you hold it, you cannot get lost. Tragedies happen, people get hurt or die, and you suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. you don't ever let go of the thread. Clinicians help their patients see the threads that run through their lives. For example, one patient saw how he frequently labeled whatever happened that could be emotionally painful to him as, quote, no big deal, unquote. We saw that when he was a child, it was easier to think it did not matter that his neglectful parents would forget to pick him up after school or camp. All the other children would have been picked up, and my patient was left standing alone. But his parents treated it as no big deal, and he learned to do the same thing. As he grew up and as an adult, when he was overlooked, he would act like it was no big deal. In the treatment, I picked up on this thread, and you would use the phrase no big deal whenever something happened that might have hurt him. He and I both understood that I was referring to his pattern of defending himself from hurt by pretending that what happened did not matter. Over time, the phrase helped him understand some of his feelings toward his wife and others. By seeing some of the origins of his defensive denial, he had a new perspective. He made more sense to himself. A process that had not been conscious became more easily accessible. It is as though he now had a file in his mind of experiences of treating events that could hurt him as no big deal. Having that file when something hurtful happened allowed him to have more conscious choices about what to do. I believe we enrich someone's life and enhance their freedom whenever we help them recognize threads. There can be something soul satisfying about participating in a process that helps someone tell their story and feel more whole. This section is called Breaking Out of Prisons. Harry Stack Sullivan defined health as the capacity to learn from new experience. I think it is an interesting definition. Whether or not you agree with this definition of health, I think we can all agree that health is more than just the absence of illness. It includes the freedom to be actively engaged in life. But that freedom is limited by blind spots. All psychoanalytic treatment aims to make unconscious experience conscious. Analysts try to help their patients become freer.
Oh, Sandra, I'm sorry, we've stopped hearing you. Can you activate your audio? Because, I'm sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we accidentally turned you off because people, when they enter the Zoom session, they enter with their mics open and we have to close them, and we accidentally closed yours. Sorry.
Okay, so I'll backtrack a couple of sentences.
Just the objective of all treatment, it is making conscious experience conscious, and then from there, I think.
Okay. Analysts try to help their patients become freer. Human beings are not free when compelled to mindlessly repeat an interpersonal pattern, that is a transference, and when unconsciously defending against perceiving something fully. I think transferences and defenses are like the bricks of a prison. Clinicians and patients take down the prison walls, that is, undo the transferences and defenses, take down the prison walls brick by brick, so patients can live freer lives. At first, we may have to help a patient endure their prison long enough to feel its limitations, nurture the passion to break out, and eventually become ready to take down the prison walls. Gwendolyn Brooks wrote a beautiful poem entitled "To Prisoners." On one level, it is dedicated to people in actual prisons, enduring terrible circumstances, extreme temperatures, anxiety, loneliness, an atmosphere of violence and despair. When I listen to this poem, first I imagine myself in a physical prison. I think of John McCain, a prisoner of war in Vietnam, who survived years of torture. He and the man in the next cell would tap lines of poetry to each other every day. That is how they survived. Is that how I would survive? Then I think about the psychological prisons, the psychological limitations imposed by repetitive transferences and defenses. How do clinicians help patients have the courage to recognize, endure their prisons long enough to establish the treatment, and eventually dismantle psychological prisons brick by brick? Here is Gwendolyn Brooks' poem, "To Prisoners." I call for you cultivation of strength in the dark, dark gardening, in the vertigo cold, in the hot paralysis, under the wolves and coyotes of particular silences, where it is dry, where it is dry. I call for you cultivation of victory over long blows that you want to give and blows you are going to get, over what wants to crumble you down, to sicken you. I call for you cultivation of strength to heal and enhance in the non-cheering dark, in the many mornings after, in the chalk and the choke. I love the phrase dark gardening. Brooks writes of the cultivation of strength in the dark and the strength to heal and enhance. I think gardening refers to the need to nurture inner seeds of fortitude. Each person may have different seeds within, different potential sources of the strength to break free. It takes patient gardening. Often we must help others and ourselves achieve victory over blows we want to give and blows we will get. Everyone endures blows and at times wants to deliver them to someone else. Perhaps your way of achieving this victory and mine are different. I invite you to think about this, and we can discuss it later. But I would suggest that dark gardening, nurturing inner resources, and victory over blows, becoming better able to bear pain and rage, are often a part of a freeing treatment process. It can feel miraculous when, after long and patient therapeutic work, greater consciousness and more psychological freedom are achieved. Prison walls come down brick by brick. This last section is called Life Forces. Another source of inspiration for clinicians can be the contact we make with the life force in our patients and ourselves. Anyone who has watched an infant knows that there is a fierce will to crawl, to stand, to walk, to run. There is power in connecting with this force. It can surmount obstacles. It can keep us striving. It can inspire both participants in treatment. Elsewhere, I've written about the joy of being part of a process that unleashes the life force. A poem by Maya Angelou, Still I Rise, captures this spirit. Angelou was a Black woman who wrote many poems about the legacies of slavery. This is a long poem, so I'm just quoting part of it. Still I rise. You may write me down in history with your bitter, twisted lies. You may trod me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken, bowed head and lowered eyes? Shoulders falling down like teardrops, weakened by my soulful cries? Out of the huts of history, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling. I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise. Into a daybreak that's wondrously clear, I rise. Bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. To me, there is no greater joy than helping someone or ourselves, or both of us, rise from, quote, a past that's rooted in pain, unquote. Whatever the nature of a human being's enslavement, clinicians nurture the dream and the hope of the slave. We help people rise, and in that process, we rise ourselves. We rise to the occasion. We are called upon to rise to a challenge. Each time we open our doors, we don't always meet that challenge, but we have a chance. If we don't meet it today, we may be able to try again tomorrow. I will never forget the time a child patient spoke to me after 2 years of silence. She came to treatment at 6, referred by the principal of her school because she seemed to think she was an animal and not a child. She physically fought against coming into my office every session. She would not talk, play, or even acknowledge me. For 2 years, I talked for both of us. I developed a way to play out loud, inviting her to join me, but not pressing her. I instituted routines. So at a certain time, I guided her to a lounge where I let her buy a treat. One day, as I was playing out loud, she said the word mustard. I had no idea what she meant, but it was the first word she said to me. I still remember the feeling I had. It was joy. Later, I understood that there was a mustard-colored chair in the lounge, and she wanted to go there. We worked together for 2 more years, and then I left that job, and I never saw her again. She definitely related to me more, but it was still a tough treatment. Her mother was very jealous of our connection, and sometimes she found excuses not to bring her daughter for sessions. I learned how hard it can be to work under these circumstances, but I also learned how important it can be to be patient, to garden in the dark, sometimes for many years without seeing any growth. With some patients, it can be very hard to rise to the occasion each session, no matter how lonely we might feel. I certainly felt lonely with this child. Sometimes I needed to tend my own garden, to cheer myself on in my mind. I developed a sense that my responsibility was to do the best work I could. I could not get her to respond to me, but I was able to keep trying. I had to believe that somewhere in her was a life force, that some part of her wanted more life than she was having. I needed faith in that because for a long time, there was no proof of it. Another patient, an adult, who had had a psychotic break and saw me in treatment in an outpatient clinic, was imprisoned psychologically by rituals. I've written about this work in my book, Clinical Values, where I called him John. As a child, John was subjected to severe isolation. Food was left by his bedroom door. He wasn't even handed food, it was left. He had virtually no social interaction aside from school. In late teens, he had a psychotic break and was hospitalized. I saw him in our outpatient clinic. John was imprisoned in a sense in his own rules and rituals. He never allowed himself to use hot water or sleep through the night. He would set his alarm clock to go off several times each night. I interpreted this as a fear of comfort itself and the emotions it might elicit. John showed very little emotion in his voice, tone, and the content of his speech. He seemed almost like a robot. Somehow intuitively, I knew that it was my job to speak up for feelings. I named the feelings he might be having based on my own. If he told me a story about his isolation, I might say something like, I imagine you were lonely, or I would have felt sad. One day, John told me a story and then said, you would say I felt, and then named an emotion. I don't remember which, but I do remember the joy I felt. I knew this was progress, a leap forward. I felt that the life force was winning. After 4 years, and when I moved on to another job, we ended the treatment. But I was truly happy when I got a letter from him telling me he was in college. These are the potential gratifications of a career doing treatment, and they are priceless. It often takes courage to move forward. I think courage can be encouraged. Courage is often the product of an interpersonal relationship. Here is a poem that exemplifies that encouragement. It's called Come to the Edge by Christopher Logue. Come to the edge. We might fall. Come to the edge. It's too high. come to the edge. And they came, and he pushed, and they flew. When we help people face what they fear, what they grieve, what they avoid, we are implicitly asking them to have courage. A patient came to treatment when she was in her 30s, married, and a very well-respected teacher. She was having suicidal thoughts and elaborate fantasies. Her husband, who was in his own treatment, encouraged her to come for psychoanalysis. I saw her 3 times a week for many years. I will call her Mary. Mary had never been in treatment before. As a child, she'd been terrified of her sadistic, moody, sometimes violent father. But I think she was even more terrified that her depressed mother would abandon the family or kill herself, which she threatened to do. Mary was the good girl, devoted to being her mother's substitute partner, absolutely dedicated to making her mother happy, doing most of the housework, cooking treats for her mother, and staying out of her father's way as much as possible. Father flirted with incestuous behavior, talking approvingly of incest, and was physically intrusive, though never actually sexual. He delighted in making Mary uncomfortable, subjecting her to touching dead animals, playing tricks on her, forcing her to dance with him. My extensive work with Mary included all 3 of the themes of this presentation. I tried to help her create a more coherent narrative of her life. I tried to help her break out of psychological prisons and tried to help her connect with her own life force. I will briefly illustrate each as I close. I believe that for Mary, her anger at her father and his sadism were conscious, already known to her before our work began. What was left out of her personal narrative was the abusive aspects of her mother's behavior toward her. Mother took advantage of Mary's vulnerability, using her to compensate for needs unmet by her husband. Mother expected Mary to sacrifice her own life, her normal needs for socializing with other teenagers, her time for herself. At times, Mother was too physically intrusive too, expecting Mary to share her bed until Mary, in her mid-teens, asserted herself and demanded her own bed. This part of the story of her life was not available to Mary at first. It was easier for her to see her father as the villain and her mother as the heroine. Helping her see more complexity in this situation enabled her to see greater complexity in other interpersonal situations. In many senses, Mary was a prisoner. She also imprisoned her husband in a way. She was haunted by fears when he was away on a business trip. She imagined he was really having an affair, and she searched for clues that this was true. She imagined she would be attacked when she was alone in the house. She could not relate socially to her neighbors or colleagues, fearing they would gang up on her and sadistically attack her verbally. She was constantly afraid of losing her job, constantly looking for evidence that she would be fired, despite absolutely no basis for this fear, as far as I could tell. In the many years of our treatment, she kept the same job and was given many awards. For me, the key that let Mary out of prison was, in part, seeing her own anger at her husband, neighbors, and colleagues. Mary was imprisoned in part by her projections of her own anger onto others. Connecting to her own life force was a vital goal in this treatment. I helped Mary understand the rage beneath her suicidal ideation. I helped her see that some of it was spite, that she would get back at everyone who neglected her, eventually including me, by killing herself. Of course, she was also identifying with her depressed and suicidal mother. She was enacting, repeating the interaction with the mother. But this time I was in Mary's position, trying to keep Mary alive instead of Mary being in the position of trying to keep her mother alive. But while insight into all of this was really helpful, it wasn't enough. Mary had to experiment with new behavior and get real satisfactions to nurture the life force within her. She had to have the courage to try out new ways to relate to her students, colleagues, neighbors, husband, and me. She had to assert herself with all of us at times, taking the chance we will be angry in return or abandon her. When she did, and when she was less afraid of being intrusive like each of her parents, she could have richer, fuller relationships. These gratifications nurtured her connection to life. Mary became more able to appreciate what she has to give to others, and others became more openly appreciative of her. Her suicidal thoughts greatly diminished and eventually became a memory. The psychoanalyst and sociologist Erich Fromm began some books and papers with the phrase, choose life. As clinicians and as human beings, we have opportunities every day, every hour, to choose life and to help others have the strength to make the same choice for themselves. I want to thank you for listening, and especially to thank Alejandro for his work in translating this. I appreciate that so much.
Quiero agradecer la escucha de todo el público y especialmente el trabajo de Alejandro y con todo y con la traducción, especialmente para la comprensión de todos.
Thank you.
Sí.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for your beautiful exposition, presentation. We pass now to the second part of the program today. Pasamos a la segunda parte del programa. Le hemos agradecido a Sandra por activa y por pasiva su preciosa presentación, muy poética. Y ahora le rogamos a Mario que participe diciéndonos su comentario. Mario, ¿estás por ahí?
Hola, buenas noches.
Hombre, Mario, saludos.
¿Qué tal?
Muy bien, ¿y tú?
Muy bien. Bueno, en primer lugar quiero dar las gracias por la invitación. Quiero saludar a Sandra Buechler y decirle que es un honor y una alegría poder compartir este espacio con ella.
Mario is going to answer or do the discussion on your paper, and he really appreciates the opportunity to do so, and he appreciates your paper and your work.
Y gracias al presidente del Instituto de Psicoterapia Relacional, y a Alejandro Ávila, y a María, que siempre está ahí apoyando en la traducción, por la invitación. Bueno, paso a leer un breve comentario para luego dejar espacio a las preguntas y al diálogo, que creo que es lo más interesante, seguir escuchando a la profesora Buechler. El trabajo de la profesora Buechler comienza con una cita de Nietzsche del ocaso de los ídolos. Si tenemos un porqué, podemos vivir con cualquier cómo, que pone en evidencia, en principio, dos cosas: que el sentido de propósito está fuertemente asociado al sostén de la esperanza y la fe en lo que hacemos, pero también algo un poco más difícil de asimilar, que no es poco frecuente que en algún momento de nuestro trabajo, de la vida, esa fe y esperanza, el sentido de lo que hacemos, se puede perder. Otra cita del mismo autor que podemos encontrar relacionada con la primera es que el hombre necesita del arte para no morir de verdad. A partir de otros trabajos, hemos asimilado esta frase como que el hombre necesita del arte para no morir de realidad, lo que subraya, y vaya si lo tenemos constatado, que la realidad puede matar al ser humano, que le puede robar hasta el último aliento de subjetividad, de humanidad. Es por eso que el trabajo de la profesora Buechler, el de hoy y el de toda su trayectoria, es de vital importancia en sentido literal. Es un antídoto contra la desesperanza y amparo frente a las tormentas y desiertos que los dilemas de la existencia en general y de la práctica clínica en particular nos compele a enfrentar. Me gustaría, por seguir en esta línea nietzscheana, decir de Sandra Buechler lo que Montaigne dijo de Plutarco, y que a su vez rescata Nietzsche en una de sus intempestivas, para referirse a Schopenhauer, su maestro por excelencia, en un ejercicio de admiración y reconocimiento que hoy, en este espacio compartido con la profesora, es de total pertinencia. Permítanme una adaptación interesada. Que una mujer así haya escrito es cosa que ha aumentado realmente el gozo de vivir en este mundo. Por mi parte, al menos, desde que conocí este espíritu máximamente libre y fuerte como ningún otro, no puedo decir de ella sino lo que otros han dicho de sus maestros. Apenas he lanzado una mirada sobre ella y ya me han crecido una pierna o un ala. Los trabajos de Sandra Buechler no solo nos enseñan sobre la práctica clínica, sobre los valores que pueden guiar nuestra labor y tal vez, sin pretenderlo, nuestra vida, sobre recursos para sobrevivir a la verdad, sobre fuentes de inspiración para nuestro trabajo y generar de este modo espacios donde la creatividad sea posible. No solo nos revela la importancia de la vida como la gran terapeuta, sino que arrojar una mirada sobre su pensamiento nos transforma. Hace que se desarrollen en nosotros nuevas capacidades, que aparezcan nuevas potencias. Nos atraviesa y transforma a nivel emocional, intelectual y físicamente. ¿Qué es, sino, una nueva pierna o un ala? Si la psicoterapia aspira a generar cambios estructurales, no solamente alivio temporal, como señala Buechler en uno de sus trabajos, si aspira a la transformación, es preciso que sea llevada a cabo por personas que estén dispuestas a transformarse en el proceso compartido que supone un tratamiento psicoterapéutico. Dichas transformaciones conllevan la búsqueda de una voz propia, de un modo singular de hacer las cosas, y en ese camino estamos indeciblemente solos, como diría Rilke en sus cartas a un joven poeta. Atravesar el desierto, y ya sabemos ahora que no todo el que va al desierto es un desertor, la tormenta o el valle oscuro, es un camino que cada persona, cada paciente, cada terapeuta, en algún momento de su vida tendrá que llevar a cabo. Se sentirá soledad, aunque no necesariamente eso quiera decir que se encuentre solo. Puede que le auxilie en esos momentos su coro interno, forjado por aquello que ha leído, las personas presentes o no, vivas o no, que han dejado huella en su vida. Se tendrá que enfrentar al vértigo del sinsentido y de sentirse diferente. ¿Cómo puede sentirse alguien con una nueva pierna o un ala, sino como una especie particular de monstruo? Pues ese es el punto al que aspiramos, en nuestros pacientes y en nosotros mismos. Como señala Kafka, a partir de cierto punto ya no hay retorno. Este es el punto a alcanzar. En el trabajo que se presenta hoy, Buechler señala 3 fuentes de inspiración que pueden servir como guías en medio de la tormenta. Construir una narrativa coherente de nuestras vidas. Detectar los patrones interpersonales que funcionan como cadenas o prisiones psicológicas y detienen o ralentizan nuestro desarrollo y liberación. Y por último, tener en cuenta la fuerza vital, la que nos habita y la que nos rodea. ¿Acaso esto no es tan importante para nuestros pacientes como para toda persona en general? Esta es una de las grandes bondades del trabajo de Sandra Buechler como pensadora y como educadora. Nos devuelve a la vida, a la gran terapeuta, como fuente de inspiración y transformación. Pero no solo eso, no nos deja solos en el camino. Describe, a través de sus libros, artículos y conferencias, un mapa que nos sirve de referencia. Nos enseña a ver la vida como el marinero en la noche puede que vea el cielo, plagado de estrellas que guían el camino como referentes, no como metas a alcanzar, o como diría ella, no como recetas. Antes de abrir el espacio al debate y a las preguntas, me gustaría contarle una cosa a Sandra Buechler, que gracias a sus trabajos, todo el año pasado, un club de lectura llamado Resistencia Relacional, del que formo parte, trabajó su libro Comprendiendo y tratando a pacientes en psicoanálisis clínico, lecciones desde la literatura, que cientos de profesionales que trabajan con violencia de género, en un improvisado ejercicio de meditación guiada, buscaron y conectaron con su coro interno, el que les auxilia, sostiene y sirve de apoyo en los momentos difíciles de su trabajo. Que este año nació un grupo de duelo para profesionales de la salud mental inspirado en su artículo Pérdidas necesarias e innecesarias, el duelo del analista. Gracias a la generosidad inconmensurable de Mercedes Güell, Catalina Munar y Sandra Toribio y todas las personas que se han embarcado en el proyecto junto con el respaldo del Instituto de Psicoterapia Relacional. Me gustaría contarle que sus conceptos e ideas, pero por sobre todo su actitud honesta y vital, características fundamentales de Buechler como educadora, han generado que su trabajo, que el cultivo oscuro, que las semillas que ha nutrido se desarrollen y crezcan, dando lugar a curiosas formas de vida, singulares, tal vez, por qué no decirlo, un poco monstruosas, pero guiadas por valores en la clínica, buscando marcar la diferencia en la vida de nuestros pacientes, todavía resistiendo, continuando con el trabajo a través de las tormentas y desiertos que implica el ejercicio de nuestra profesión. Gracias a las fuentes de inspiración que generan espacios donde la creatividad es posible, y gracias a ello nos sentimos menos solos, sosteniendo la esperanza, y de este modo podemos encontrar más recursos para enfrentarnos a la compleja tarea del vivir, de estar en la vida. La vida, esa gran terapeuta. Muchas gracias, Sandra Buechler.
Thank you so much.
Me gustaría, no sé, con el permiso de Carlos y de María, plantear una primera pregunta como forma de abrir el debate y el espacio de preguntas, si es posible.
¿Cómo no?
Bien.
Mario is going to ask you the first question now in the section for debate, okay? I'll
Yes.
translate it for you.
Intentaré hablar despacio. Bueno, son dos preguntas.
Okay, two questions.
La primera es, en cierto momento, en su trabajo se refiere a cultivar en la oscuridad la victoria sobre los golpes que querríamos dar o la fuerza para resistir los golpes que recibimos. Me gustaría que nos hablara un poco más respecto a su forma de buscar la victoria sobre los golpes.
Okay, so he actually has two questions, but the first one makes reference to, in your text, you speak about cultivating in darkness victory over the hard things in life that you receive from others. And do you remember that?
Victory over blows. You
Blows.
want to give others, and blows you are going to get.
Exactly. So he would like you to expand a bit on how you achieve that victory, how you go about that.
Y digo la segunda ya, o...
Okay, do you want him to say his second question? Or...
Sure.
Sí, vale,
Sí.
pues plantea la segunda y así se dirige a todos.
A lo largo de sus trabajos, nos habla de las inversiones no narcisistas en el tratamiento como forma de proteger la confianza del clínico. Si nos podría hablar sobre ese concepto y de qué manera lo ha aplicado a alguno de los tratamientos que menciona.
Mhm. Okay, so the second question has to do with, you have spoken in some of your works about the non-narcissistic investment, I think it is, to protect
Right.
the confidence of the clinician. So he would like to know how you have applied that to some of the treatments.
Okay, thank you. First of all, before I say an answer to these questions, I really want to thank the people who are making this possible. The translation, Maria, Alejandro, and Mario and Carlos. I really want to thank you very much.
Okay. En primer lugar, antes de contestar las preguntas, quiere agradecer profundamente a las personas que han hecho que sea posible tener esta conferencia hoy. Al trabajo de Alejandro, de Carlos, de Mario, de la traducción, todos los que están y estamos involucrados en que se pueda llevar a cabo este evento. Okay.
When I started to think about this presentation, I did not realize how relevant the issues of aloneness and the issues of having courage to face life would be in 2022.
Okay, can I translate that, please?
Please, please.
Okay. Cuando empezó a pensar en esta presentación para realizar en enero de este año, no se daba cuenta de la importancia y de lo relevante que eran los temas de la soledad y de tener el valor para afrontar las cosas que esos conceptos o esos valores iban a tener en este año 2022.
There is no time I can remember where it's been more important to understand the difference between alone and lonely.
Nunca ha habido momentos anteriores que ella recuerde que sea tan importante como ahora conocer y comprender la diferencia entre la soledad y estar solo.
And to respond to something Mario said, there is no time I can remember when it wasn't more important to apply the values I'm talking about to both our clinical work and our lives.
También añade, para ir respondiendo a las preguntas de Mario, que tampoco recuerda otra época que haya sido tan importante como ahora el aplicar estos valores tanto a los casos clínicos, al tratamiento clínico, como a nosotros mismos también.
And finally, about his comments, I wanted to say to Mario, thank you for letting me know about the groups that have used my work. I appreciate it.
También agradece mucho y el conocimiento de que ha comentado Mario, el que se estén utilizando su trabajo y sus libros para realizar grupos de trabajo en la actualidad, ¿no? Entonces, que es algo que agradece muchísimo que se esté llevando a cabo ese trabajo.
Now, the first question, victory over blows, that is punches. You want to give someone or something or life itself, and the punches you know you're going to get.
Entonces, para ir respondiendo a las preguntas, la primera pregunta sobre la victoria sobre los golpes. Los golpes que tú le quieres propinar a alguien, a quien sea, o a la vida misma, así como los golpes que recibes de los demás o de la vida.
So, to put it very, very succinctly, it's how do we deal with rage and pain.
Entonces, para resumirlo de forma muy sucinta, es cómo manejamos la ira y el dolor.
And what I believe from my days as an emotion theorist and my clinical work, that the only power that's strong enough to deal with these emotions comes from other emotions.
Entonces, lo que ella cree, gracias a su trabajo como terapeuta de las emociones y también a través de su trabajo clínico, que el único poder que se puede utilizar es otras emociones para ayudar a estas.
In other words, we have the power to deal with our anger and our pain and sadness because we also have joy and love and curiosity and hope.
Es decir, el poder para poder manejar las emociones de la ira, del dolor y de la tristeza es utilizar las otras emociones de alegría, del amor y de la curiosidad por lo que nos rodea.
I always have the image of a little child taking their first steps. They take their first steps toward the arms of their parent.
Siempre tiene en mente la imagen de ese niño dando sus primeros pasos. Esos primeros pasos que da hacia los brazos abiertos de sus padres.
Hopefully, we also take our last steps towards someone who loves us.
Esperamos que también nuestros últimos pasos sean encaminados hacia alguien que nos quiere.
We face the difficult things in life out of love, out of inspiration, out of joy, out of what we get from our relationships.
Somos capaces de afrontar las cosas difíciles que nos da la vida gracias al amor, a la inspiración, la alegría que nos propinan otras experiencias y otras cosas.
Now, a second question, what I mean to say about the non-narcissistic investments that clinicians make in our work. What I mean by that is we don't have to have the patient be successful to make us look good.
Vale. En cuanto a la segunda pregunta, cuando ella se refiere, Mario, a las inversiones no narcisistas, quiere decir que no es necesario que el paciente tenga éxito para hacer que nosotros nos sintamos bien, que estamos haciendo un buen trabajo.
We care about the quality of the patient's life for itself, not to ring up a success.
Nos debe de importar la cualidad de la vida del paciente mismo, no el que sea un éxito y eso refleje en nosotros.
Now, this is harder to do when you're first starting in practice or in your clinical work, and you have often a very strong need to prove yourself.
Dice que esto es más difícil hacer al principio, cuando se empieza el trabajo clínico. Entonces hay una fuerte necesidad de sentirse valorado y tener esa confirmación del trabajo.
And I'm sorry.
No, es que, yeah.
And one of Stephen Mitchell's insights was that it is ironic that you will probably see the hardest patients you'll ever see early in your practice, before you have real confidence and know that you're capable.
La ironía de la que hablaba Stephen Mitchell es que probablemente los pacientes más difíciles y más duros serán los que primero se tratan cuando se empieza la práctica y no se tiene todavía la confianza del trabajo propio.
In my experience, that was both fortunate and unfortunate. It was unfortunate because I was so unsure of myself. I didn't have confidence, and the work with such difficult patients often didn't help me feel I should have confidence. But it was fortunate because I put my whole self into it. I had the energy of a young therapist.
Dice que en su propia experiencia fue así. Al principio tenía muchas inseguridades y esto ha sido desafortunado por un lado, pero también afortunado. Desafortunado en que tenía tanta inseguridad que no tenía ninguna confianza y que muchas veces los pacientes tampoco hacían nada por alimentar su confianza. Sin embargo, la fortuna de esa situación es que tenía la energía y la capacidad para dedicarse de lleno a la labor y ir haciendo su trabajo y creyendo poco a poco más en sí misma, pero con energía por esa misma juventud, ¿no?
But I would say, in conclusion, that the ability to develop a non-narcissistic investment in our patients, a non-narcissistic desire to help them, is something that is enhanced by training very often. Training helps you develop your own style of work. And as you develop your own style, you have less of a need to prove yourself.
Okay. Para concluir, dice que la habilidad para desarrollar esa inversión no narcisista en los pacientes, en querer ayudarles por sí mismo, ese deseo de ayuda, se puede conseguir también a través de la formación. El desarrollar un estilo propio también reforzará el que se tenga más confianza cada uno en su propio estilo y en su propio trabajo.
Can we take other questions? Is that okay?
¿Está bien así, Mario?
Thank you very much, professor.
Yeah.
Gracias, María.
Gracias. ¿Más preguntas?
Yo quiero aprovechar hacer un pequeño paréntesis para decir algo que no quiero que al final se disuelva o se pierda. Quiero agradecer mucho la presentación de Sandra Buechler. Quiero también agradecer encarecidamente el comentario de Mario Nervi, que ha sido precioso también, y cosas que luego a veces se olvidan. La traducción tan concienzuda que está haciendo y seguirá haciendo María Hernández aquí a mi lado, porque a veces creemos que las traducciones son cosas simples y que van por sí mismas. Yo quería, no sé si hay preguntas, tendríamos preguntas a través del chat. De momento quería hacer un señalamiento a la comunicación de Sandra. Cuando dice al principio, dice, over the time the phrase helped him understand some of his feelings towards his wife and others. Me refiero a esta sensación de soledad y a la sensación el temor al abandono que surge de manera muy frecuente en la clínica actual, es decir, en los pacientes que atendemos. Eso me ha recordado también el caso de un paciente que yo tenía tuve hace años, que tenía un tremendo pavor a la soledad, que no era capaz de estar solo, se defendía por todos los medios, y que una de las cosas que me comentó en las sesiones fue que cuando él era pequeño, él y sus hermanos, sus padres les dejaban solos en casa, encerrados, y se iban por ahí a divertirse. Y como esa vivencia tan temprana de abandono y de soledad, que es muy destructiva.
So Carlos was also appreciating and thanking you very much for your work, for thanking Mario also for his discussion, and also for the translation of all this work. He comments when you were talking about in your paper about the
Loneliness.
The patient who was had the issues of solitude and abandon, who had been couldn't leave the house and was fed through the door and so on. He says that is something, this fear of abandon and the issues with being alone are very present in our clinical work today. He says he recalls, this is recurring, but he recalls specifically a patient he had some years ago who was totally in terror of being alone. He would do all kinds of things to avoid being alone. And he said that when he and his siblings were young, the parents would lock them up in the house and go out. He says that this was very destructive.
Shall I comment? Is that?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Carlos. This is reminding me of a phrase I've always used to tell the difference between alone and lonely. That the quality, the feeling of aloneness depends on who you're with when you're alone. I'll explain that, but maybe you should translate it.
Yeah, please. Okay, so muchas gracias, Carlos, por este comentario, y me recuerda que es importante destacar la diferencia entre la soledad y estar solo.
¿Me permites un momentito?
Sí.
Con esta traducción de la lonely, me he encontrado varias veces. No hay una solución exacta en español. Yo lo diferencio con el solo y solitario, la diferencia entre estar solo y estar solitario. Si hay alguna otra, si se me ocurre algo mejor, os lo diré.
Sí, efectivamente. He's just explaining that
Elaborate.
alone and lonely in Spanish is not easily translated. The
Ah.
steps. Okay, so he translates it as like
Ah.
alone and solitude.
Ah,
Okay, so he
thank you. I didn't know that.
brings in the word solitude.
Yes.
Eh,
Well,
Entonces, let me just finish because he kind of
yeah.
interrupted there on the alone and lonely, estar solo o solitario, ¿no?
Es sentirse solo. Yo diría que
Sen-
más un sentimiento. Lonely es sentirse solo.
Sí, sí, yo creo que sentirse solo y estar solo, ¿no? Lo que dice Sandra es que esa sensación de estar solo depende de con quién uno está cuando está solo. Okay. Yes, you can continue now. Yes.
what I mean is,
Mhm.
when we're alone with our internal objects.
Mhm.
So that's who we're with when we're alone.
Mm.
And what that is like depends on whether those internal objects are attacking us or they're loving us. Who we're with when we're alone is our internal relationships.
Entonces, lo que comenta Sandra es que cuando estamos solos, ¿con quién estamos? Se refiere a con qué objetos internos estamos. Y la forma en que vamos a estar solos va a depender si esos objetos internos nos están atacando o nos aman. Esas son las relaciones internas.
And just to bring out another point, Frieda Fromm-Reichmann, in her last paper, which she never finished, which was called On Loneliness, she talked about a prisoner in World War II who was in solitary confinement. I'll let you translate it and I'll tell the rest of the story.
Okay, great. Ya que estamos hablando del tema de la soledad, quiere señalar otra idea. Frieda Fromm escribió un último texto que nunca terminó y que se titulaba Sobre la soledad. Era sobre un prisionero de la Segunda Guerra Mundial que estaba en confinamiento, en aislamiento, confinamiento solitario, no. Estaba completamente aislado. Y ahora nos continúa con la historia. Okay?
But this man, even though he was alone, was not terribly lonely. He didn't suffer because he felt there was a purpose, there was a meaning to his being imprisoned, and it was not something he did wrong. He was imprisoned because he was Jewish, basically. And so he felt a connection inside him with all his ancestors, a positive connection.
Se trata de un hombre que estaba prisionero en aislamiento, como comentó, que estaba solo. Sin embargo, no se sentía solo. No estaba sufriendo por esa soledad, porque sentía que había un significado. El que él estuviera prisionero tenía un sentido. No era porque él hubiera hecho algo malo, era judío, ¿vale? Pero tenía una conexión muy positiva con sus familiares y sus ancestros.
No sé. Sí, Alejandro quería comentar algo. Alejandro, por favor.
Thank you, Sandra. That was
sí, buenas noches. Un verdadero placer escuchar a Sandra y también a Mario su comentario. Creo que Mario ha subrayado lo esencial, porque cuando Sandra subraya lo que para mí es una auténtica definición del objetivo de la psicoterapia, construir, crear o recrear una narrativa más coherente de la propia vida, lo cual implica aliviar la presión de las defensas o de las acomodaciones patológicas, e implica la vitalización, ¿no? Creo que esto es lo esencial del proceso terapéutico, ¿no? Y la evocación que hace Sandra de la niña que pasó tanto tiempo muda, ¿no? Me ha recordado lo difícil y que fue para mí trabajar con una paciente adulta que durante un año no habló. Y que, bueno, después de ese año empezó a hablar con mucha dificultad. Y que después de un tiempo simbolizó todo ese proceso en dos muñequitos, en dos marionetas que me regaló y que conservo desde entonces, hace más de 40 años prácticamente. Que era una muñequita muda, sin boca, y la figura de un mago. Y no hizo ningún comentario al respecto, simplemente me lo entregó y continuó su vida en la que de alguna manera mostró que se había vitalizado y había escapado de bastantes prisiones psicológicas. Creo que trabajos como el de Sandra y de los muchos terapeutas que se inspiran en ella nos dan la fuerza para continuar trabajando, no animados por la ilusión de omnipotencia, sino simplemente por la capacidad para estar con otro y acompañarle.
Alejandro has given us a story of a patient of his responding to the important things that you have underlined in your paper about the importance of creating a narrative and really loosening or lowering the depression of defenses and working on finding the person's vital force. So he recalls the story of a patient he had many years ago when he read about the child that you worked with who didn't speak for 2 years. Okay, so he recalled a case of his, a patient that he worked with who did not speak for a whole year. And after that time, she finally, with great difficulty, began to speak. And when at the end, she gave Alejandro a present. They were 2 dolls, like 2 marionettes, symbolized. One was a doll without a mouth, and the other was a magician. She gave them to Alejandro and continued her life, showing that the vital force to live had bloomed and opened, and those prison walls had fallen somewhat. Your work inspires many therapists to not work from the illusion of omnipotence, but rather from the desire to be and accompany the other. To be with and accompany the other.
Yes.
Tenemos los comentarios del margen que tendrías que ir mirando.
Okay.
Es que desde aquí no los veo.
Okay. So there are some questions that people who are online are asking. For example.
I'd like to respond to Alejandro's
Sure. Okay.
first.
A contestar a Alejandro.
Of course.
Yeah, thank you, Alejandro. And I think both your example and mine are examples of something that clinicians have to endure, to bear a certain kind of aloneness with the patient. We're with someone, but they're not speaking to us. And we really have, in a way, a very strange situation to be with someone who for a year does not speak. And I think what helps us is a sense that, first of all, there is within that person, there is a life force, a need that's not being expressed to connect. We have to believe that without any evidence, that everyone wants to connect with other human beings, even when they don't show it and even when they don't consciously know it. And I think that your point is very important, that it's not out of omnipotence. It's not out of feeling that you're all powerful in any way, but it's out of accompanying, being with. And that is really where the treatment power comes from.
Quiero agradecer a Alejandro su comentario y que cree que efectivamente ambos ejemplos muestran las dificultades que a veces tiene que soportar el clínico a la hora de estar con pacientes que no hablan. Estar con ellos de una forma extraña porque no nos están comunicando nada a través verbalmente y estar con ellos durante un año es muy difícil cuando no nos están hablando. Nos hace sentir un poco, y lo que nos ayuda, lo que nos ayuda en ese sentido es pensar que dentro de la persona debe de haber una fuerza vital, una necesidad de conectar que no está expresada. Todos necesitan conexión y buscamos conexión con los demás. Que efectivamente estar con el paciente, lo importante, como ha dicho Alejandro, es el hecho de acompañar y de estar con, no por un deseo omnipotente, sino el verdaderamente querer estar con el paciente. Y de ahí es de donde viene el poder del tratamiento.
Let me just add to that, that what I think happened in my treatment with the little girl, I was not omnipotent, that is, I didn't have superhuman power, but I did have the strength that she could not kill me with her silence. And I had to demonstrate that.
En el caso, quería añadir una cosa, en el caso del tratamiento suyo con la niña pequeña, no es que ella fuera, Sandra, fuera omnipotente ni que tuviera ningún poder superhumano, simplemente era necesario demostrarle a la niña que ella tenía la fortaleza suficiente para que no morir. O sea, que la niña no pudiera con ella, no pudiera matarla, que ella permanecía y estaba. You stayed with her all that time.
And she didn't kill me, no matter how angry she was. I mean, she really fought not to get into my room. But she didn't kill me, and she didn't kill my desire to help her.
A pesar de que la niña luchaba con fuerza no entrar en la sala, en la consulta. La fuerza que tuvo el tratamiento es que la niña pudo constatar que no pudo con Sandra. Ella permaneció y se quedaba con ella y no pudo matarla, a pesar de su rabia, ¿no?, que tenía la niña. Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to see some other comments here. Here's one. It's already in English, so I'm going to go ahead with that one. Montserrat says, I wonder about the manifestation of emotions in the body. Sandra, do you take into account the body in treatment when mentalization is not quite available yet in the patient? Voy a leerlo en español, que Montserrat ha sido tan amable de ponerlo en los dos idiomas. La pregunta es, me pregunto sobre la manifestación de las emociones en el cuerpo. En sus tratamientos, ¿Sandra toma en cuenta lo corporal cuando la mentalización no está disponible en los recursos del paciente?
Yes, the answer is yes. So when a person first comes into treatment, aside from the words, we also take in the facial expression, the muscles of the face, when they tense, what emotion they're showing, and the body. Is the body tense? Does it move around in nervousness, or is it calm? What are the signals from the body and the face?
Sí, efectivamente se tiene en cuenta el lenguaje corporal de la persona. Cuando entra una persona por primera vez en tratamiento, tomamos nota, aparte de su expresión verbal, también de su expresión facial. Cuando se tensan, qué emociones afloran en su cara, cómo se mueve el cuerpo, si se mueve de forma nerviosa. Todas esas señales también las tenemos en cuenta.
What I was taught in my training was to try to be very aware of changes, shifts in the anxiety level in the patient's body and my own. When the anxiety was rising too much, it was up to the clinician to try to do something about that.
Lo que a ella se le enseñó en su formación es estar muy pendiente de los cambios del nivel de ansiedad en un paciente, tanto en el paciente y en su cuerpo como en el suyo propio. Entonces, estar muy pendiente para observar cuando esa ansiedad empieza a subir, sobre todo.
I have in my own work expanded that to say we should try to be aware not just of shifts of anxiety, but of shifts in any emotion.
En su propio trabajo, Sandra ha ampliado esta idea de estar pendiente de los cambios en la ansiedad, lo ha ampliado a incluir todas las emociones, no solo en las de ansiedad, sino cualquier cambio de emoción en el paciente o en uno mismo también. Both in the patient and in the clinician.
Yes. Other questions or thoughts?
Yes, there's another question here. I'm just going to read it in Spanish first. Otra pregunta que se plantea, ¿qué importancia tiene para usted que el terapeuta fomente activamente con el paciente nuevos comportamientos en la realidad externa más allá del insight? So here's a question from Carlos Jimenez. He asks, how important is it for you as a therapist to actively encourage in patients new behaviors and related to the external reality of beyond insight.
Yes, it's so important. It's so important with everyone. One of the ways I defined therapy in my second book is that the therapist is a catalyst. What I mean by that is treatment becomes a laboratory where the patient can try out new behavior that they can then live out outside the therapy.
Ok. Muchas gracias por esta pregunta. Efectivamente, es de muchísima importancia con todos. Una forma en que ella define la terapia en su segundo libro es que el terapeuta es un catalizador. Con esto quiere decir que la terapia es como un laboratorio donde se ensayan nuevos comportamientos para luego aplicarlos en el mundo más allá de la clínica, de la consulta.
Example, the patient that I talked about, who I called Mary, the school teacher, I talked about at the end of my paper. She tried out with me being able to assert herself, stand up to me, say, for example, I didn't like what you said in the last session. This is something she never could have said before. And then when she was able to do that with me, she could do it in the outside world. So to me, it's not just people inpatient or out, it's everyone has to try out new behavior in the therapy that they feel safe enough to try in the therapy and then take it to the outside world.
En su presentación nos ha hablado de la paciente Mary, la profesora. Trabajó el tema de la asertividad con esta paciente. Cuando consiguió que la paciente en sesión fuera capaz de decirle a ella, no me gustó lo que me dijiste en la sesión pasada, y que fuera capaz de decir esto, que nunca hubiera sido capaz de ser así de asertiva, luego ella pudo empezar a tener esa misma postura o asertividad fuera de la consulta. Todos deben de poder intentar nuevos comportamientos en un lugar seguro, probarlos con seguridad y con la confianza dentro de la terapia para luego poder extender esos nuevos comportamientos al exterior, a la vida real. Okay. Thank you. Okay, we have a question here. Marta has a question. ¿Se la quieres decir tú?
No, te lo digo en español, Juanita. A mí también me ha impresionado mucho, como a Alejandro y a Mario, cómo Sandra, porque me parece que es una cualidad que ella tiene, que es como poner en claro cosas muy complejas y cómo ha clarificado con 3 puntos lo que es la esencia del tratamiento, ¿no? Y pensando en esos 3 aspectos que ella dice, como que los 2 primeros me parece que, bueno, estoy aprendiendo a aplicarlos, pero me siento como en cierta medida más segura. Me parece más difícil el tema de que el paciente conecte con una fuerza vital o despertar en él una fuerza vital, ¿no? Y un poco retomando lo que dice Alejandro, y intuyo o desde luego siento que las palabras o las acciones directas no son efectivas. Y lo que funciona más efectivamente es una forma de estar o formas de estar con el paciente. Entonces, yo le quería preguntar a Sandra si ella podía hablarnos un poco más de qué formas ella está con el paciente que pueden ayudar a despertar esa fuerza vital.
Vale. Okay, so Marta works here as well with us, and she's helping with all this. So it's working today. She has a question. Pointing out things that Alejandro and Mario have also pointed out, and it's how you so easily clarify ideas that are so complex. how you have summarized in 3 essential points the essence of treatment is very welcoming, and so it's easy to follow. Now, she's learning, and we're all learning how to apply these essential points in therapy. And what she thinks is most difficult is to connect with the vital force in a patient. She believes that perhaps it's more a matter of how you are with the patient, to be with the patient, rather than direct words or actions or direct actions. It's more a way of being with the patient. So her question is, how are you with the patient that you would say could help the patient connect with the vital force?
I will answer that even more succinctly, economically than usual. In one word, effort. Effort is communicated to the patient through our faces, through our tones, through our bodies, through our words. When we try hard, we are implicitly telling the patient that they matter, that their life matters, that the treatment matters. And you can try hard, whatever your theoretical orientation. You can try hard as a classical Freudian to understand. You can try hard as a relational. You can try hard to understand.
Como era de esperar.
Okay. So, muchas gracias, Marta, por la pregunta, y va a hacer una respuesta muy sucinta. La va a hacer en una sola pregunta, en una sola palabra. Esa palabra es esfuerzo. Cuando se hace un esfuerzo como terapeuta y se intenta hacer ese esfuerzo frente al paciente, implícitamente se le está diciendo al paciente que importa. Si pruebas de verdad, haces el esfuerzo y no importa qué tipo de orientación teórica puedas tener, se transmite al paciente que importa. Y eso es la forma de conectar con esa comprensión y esa fuerza vital.
Ya me adelantaba yo a la respuesta. Como era de esperar, tenemos varias peticiones de palabra. De momento veo a María Margarita Mulet. Luego veremos al resto. Cuando quieras, María.
Bueno, yo quería saber su opinión con respecto a otros profesionales de la salud. Yo nunca había recibido tantas peticiones de ayuda durante la pandemia de profesionales que trabajaban pues, en urgencias, en UCI, ambulancias, médicos de familia, limpiadoras de urgencias, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Entonces, yo valoro muchísimo el reconocimiento que hace a los psicoterapeutas, pero mi pregunta sería, ¿qué importancia le da para el apoyo, el abordaje de estos colegas, el reconocimiento profesional, el esfuerzo que realizan y que muchas veces se plantean abandonar la profesión en estas circunstancias, ¿no? Es lo que llamamos el síndrome del quemado. ¿Qué importancia le da al reconocimiento, al mostrar la potencialidad que tienen y a intentar revitalizar o la reconexión con su vitalidad? Me gustaría saber su opinión, ¿no?
Okay, so we have a question regarding what you think about other health professionals. Her experience during the pandemic and this times we're living is that she has been approached by many other health professionals doctors, nurses, people who work in ambulances, even the cleaning personnel in hospitals who are undergoing burnout situations.
Yeah.
And so her question is, how important is it for you to approach the effort that these people have and help them reconnect with their vital force to continue with their so important work?
Well, of course, it's of tremendous importance to reach out to people on the front lines and the people who are getting us all through a terrible, terrible crisis time. It's tremendously important. I think what we're talking about are universal things. They're just as applicable to the person doing the cleaning as the person heading the department. We have this humanity in common. We all need our lives to have meaning to ourselves and other people. We all need relationship. There's no difference in that sense between us. Let me let you translate that, and I want to go back to the question of effort for a moment too.
Okay, sure. Muchas gracias por la pregunta. Efectivamente, piensa que es tremendamente importante estar apoyando a las personas que están en primera línea y que están consiguiendo que podamos seguir adelante en estos momentos de terrible crisis que estamos viviendo. Piensa que realmente son temas universales, que es tan aplicable para el limpiador como lo es para el médico. Todos necesitamos sentir que la vida tiene un sentido y que nuestra vida tiene un significado y que nos tenemos que relacionar y que a través de la relación conseguimos esa importancia, ¿no? Logramos desarrollar el significado de nuestra vida y que esto es universal para todas las personas. También ahora quería retomar un poco el tema que ha comentado antes sobre el esfuerzo en el tratamiento. Nos va a ampliar un poco ese concepto. Okay.
Okay, so just going back for a moment to the question of effort and how it's expressed. It's so many ways, including trying hard to remember what happened in the last session, including trying to make connections between the patient's early life and what's going on in the treatment, including wanting to reschedule sessions when they're missed. Effort is expressed in so very many ways, verbal and nonverbal. Let me let you translate that, and then I want to go back to this burnout question.
Okay. Hablando de nuevo sobre el tema del esfuerzo del terapeuta, dice que ese esfuerzo se expresa de tantísimas maneras, tanto al intentar recordar qué es lo que ocurrió en la última sesión, al hacer el esfuerzo de realizar o buscar conexiones entre la vida temprana del paciente y lo que le está sucediendo ahora, el esfuerzo que se realiza cuando se falla o no viene a una sesión y se le hace un hueco en otro momento, eso es otro esfuerzo. Son esfuerzos tanto verbales como no verbales. Ahora va a volver a hablar sobre el tema del síndrome del quemado, del burnout. Okay.
So, in a way, what I'm saying about effort is that the most important interpretation we ever make is the way we live with the patient in the session.
Lo que quiere decir al final sobre el esfuerzo es que la interpretación más importante que se realiza con el paciente es la forma en la que estamos con el paciente, cómo vivimos con el paciente.
Now, about burnout, I always think in terms of addition rather than subtraction. What I mean by that is we can never get rid of a feeling, whether it's burnout or it's shame or it's guilt or it's anger, whatever it is. We can't get rid of feelings, but we can add something to them, and that changes the balance. What is missing in the burnt out person of hope, of love, of joy? What's missing? We can't take away a feeling. There is no way. Burnout is a feeling that in some senses probably we all feel by now. We can only ask what can be added.
Referente al síndrome del quemado, Sandra nos indica que siempre piensa en términos de sumar y no de restar. No se puede quitar una emoción o una sensación, ya sea la sensación de estar quemados, la vergüenza, la culpa. Esas emociones no se pueden quitar, no se pueden erradicar. Lo que podemos hacer es añadir para cambiar el equilibrio. ¿Qué es lo que falta en una persona que está quemada? La esperanza, el amor. No se puede quitar esa sensación. Todos a estas alturas nos sentimos quemados. Pero ¿qué es lo que qué emoción podemos añadir para que ese equilibrio cambie?
Just to add to that, I would say in the most difficult times in my own life, one of the things I took from them is that the only thing I can control is how I live what life presents to me, whether it's burnout or it's the horrors of what people are going through now. I can only do something about how I live it. I can't change the fact that we're going through this crisis.
Añade que en los tiempos y en los momentos más duros de su vida, lo que ha aprendido de ellos, lo que se ha llevado de esas situaciones tan difíciles y complicadas, es que no se puede controlar aquello que la vida nos presenta, ya sea los horrores que estamos viviendo ahora, el estar quemados, todas esas cosas. Pero lo que sí puedo es cambiar mi actitud ante ello. ¿Cómo lo vivo yo? ¿Cómo lo vivimos y cómo afrontamos esas dificultades? Sobre eso sí tenemos control.
Tenemos dos palabras pedidas, una de hace tiempo por internet de José González Guerras y otra en la sala. Empezamos, José, cuando quieras.
Gracias. Buenas noches y felicitar a Sandra Buechler y también a Mario por interesantísimas palabras que nos han traído. Bien, mi pregunta era, en el tratamiento, lógicamente, pues nosotros trabajamos con el reconocimiento de las defensas y de los patrones relacionales de nuestros pacientes, de esas defensas y esos patrones relacionales que son rígidos, ¿no? Y que de alguna forma desconectan al paciente de sí mismo y de los otros. Pero lo que yo me gustaría comentar, o que comentara Sandra Buechler, cuando de alguna manera estos patrones relacionales y estas defensas son el producto de una fuerza vital, por decirlo. Lo voy a expresar con una paciente muy breve, que esta mañana he tenido la oportunidad de atenderla por primera vez. Es una paciente que es profesora de filosofía en la universidad y que su gran defensa, bueno, la primera sesión y por lo que más hemos podido ver es la intelectualización, ¿no? Bueno, pues es una paciente con una mamá con alcohólica de siempre, la conoce tumbada en la cama con obesidad mórbida y con un problema enorme de alcoholismo, y un padre incluso tan patológico o más que la mamá. Entonces, lo que yo digo es, menos mal, y la fuerza vital ha estado ahí en ella, ¿no? En que ha podido crear estos patrones defensivos y esta forma de relacionarse desde la intelectualización. Lógicamente, sobre todo esto es sobre lo que tenemos que trabajar, pero los patrones relacionales y las defensas también son producto de esta fuerza vital. Me gustaría que le sugiere que me podría decir Sandra Buechler al respecto. Muchas gracias.
Okay, so Jose would like to also thank you for your presentation and Mario for his discussion as well. He has a question regarding work in treatment with the recognition of defenses in patients. He has a case of a patient he, in fact, just had a session this morning, and how this, what he wants to point out is how the vital force in the patient and in us also help create those defenses and relational patterns to survive the situation. So in the case of this patient, she's a university philosophy professor, and her defense and relational pattern is the intellectualization of situations. She has a mother who's an alcoholic, has always been alcoholic, and is morbidly obese today, and her father is pathological. So he points out that her vital force has helped her create these defensive patterns, which in her case is the intellectualization. So he wants to say, ask you what you think about that.
I think he couldn't be more right. Yes, defenses are not the enemy. I think when we're young, particularly, that's my experience, we often embody that as though the defenses are an enemy. This person developed the way they function for reasons. There are reasons they developed that. What has to happen is that the cost of the defenses has to become greater than their benefit in the person's life. The person has to become stronger so they don't need the defenses as much. And they realize how much the defenses are costing. So the balance shifts. And now the need for the defense is lower, and the person really sees the cost of the defense. So that shifts them toward using the defense less.
Dice Sandra que tienes absolutamente la razón. Efectivamente, las defensas son creadas por la persona, necesarias para sobrevivir. Hay que cambiar un poco el concepto que tenemos cuando quizás somos más jóvenes o empezamos en la terapia, pensar que las defensas son el enemigo. No lo son, la defensa no es el enemigo, están ahí por una razón. Lo que tiene que ocurrir es que la persona empiece a ver el coste que tiene esa defensa y poco a poco hacerse más fuerte para que haya un equilibrio distinto, haya un cambio, para que conociendo y viendo y tomando conciencia del coste que tiene esa defensa, poco a poco la vaya utilizando menos y vaya poniendo en equilibrio ese defensa-coste para ir logrando ese cambio.
In other words, let me just say, in other words, this person had to develop intellectualized defenses to deal with an alcoholic mother and a pathological father, but she has to really incorporate that not everyone will be like that she doesn't have to carry on being that way the rest of her life, and that it's costing her something in terms of emotional vividness of life, passion.
Añade que esta persona que ha tenido que desarrollar esta defensa de la intelectualización para poder manejar la situación con una madre alcohólica y el padre patológico, tiene que ir entendiendo que no todo el mundo es así, no todo el mundo es como sus padres, y que el coste emocional que supone el desvincularse de la pasión al utilizar la intelectualización.
La última pregunta, porque ya llevamos 2 horas.
We're going with the last question now.
Por favor.
Sí, muchas gracias y también agradecer por la buena predisposición de enseñarnos. Quería profundizar sobre la soledad, en especial sobre ese miedo a la soledad. Hay situaciones en donde la realidad en el hoy hace que la persona sí tenga buenos vínculos, buen entorno familiares, amicales, pero cuando se profundiza se ve que más es la angustia, la futura soledad y en especial a la pareja. Y quería consultar cómo es que transmite esa esperanza y cómo disminuye ese miedo a la futura soledad.
Okay. So our last question comes from the room here. She wants to ask you about loneliness, the fear of loneliness, the fear of being alone. She has an experience with a patient, who, when explored, she sees this patient has good relationships and has good bonding, but is anxious about thinking about future solitude. So how would you transmit to this patient in order to help the patient lose some of this anxiety about the future and fear of future solitude?
Well, part of the difference between alone and lonely is that people who are really lonely feel that it will last forever. They see, as I think this person is saying, they see the future as filled with loneliness. And if you think about the lonely adolescent, the lonely teenager, I think that example it can come across to all of us, that a lonely teenager feels as though they're always going to be alone. And I think the therapy can help in 2 ways. First of all, that in the relationship with the therapist, the patient obviously can feel less alone because you're a team, you're together. But also what I would ask is, what does this person believe about themselves? What does this person believe about their own character that makes them think they will be alone in the future? What are the beliefs about herself, even though she's had good relationships? What is it she thinks about herself, feels about herself, that makes her imagine that her future will be lonely? And I don't know the answer, but that's what I would look for.
Bien. Sandra nos dice que parte de la respuesta es un poco el tema este de la diferencia entre la soledad y el solo y
solitud.
Sí, y la solitud, eso es. Bueno, dice que ¿qué le pasa a la gente que piensa, o sea, en qué están pensando cuando piensan que siempre van a estar solos, ¿no? Nos pone el ejemplo para que visualicemos un poco un adolescente que está solo y piensa que siempre va a estar solo, ¿no? Las personas que tienen este temor a la soledad y ven el futuro como lleno de soledad, cuando piensan en la soledad piensan que va a durar siempre. Entonces, dice que hay dos aspectos. Uno es la propia relación con el terapeuta. En esa propia relación con el terapeuta ya estamos demostrando que no está solo, que somos un equipo, que estamos juntos. Y ahí ya estamos haciendo que vea que no está solo. Y lo segundo, a lo que no tiene respuesta, pero sería interesante indagar, es qué creencia tiene esa persona, ese paciente, sobre sí misma, qué sentimientos tiene, de por qué piensa que su futuro va a ser solitario. ¿Qué sensaciones tiene sobre sí misma que hace que vean su futuro como solitario? Eso sería... Vale.
Muchas gracias, Sandra.
Thank you.
We'll meet again tomorrow.
At